The greatest myth about the civil rights movement is that it was only necessary in the South. Racism exists to America's core. It's in its DNA. It has permeated from shore to shore. One needs not only seek out places like Selma or Montgomery or Jackson or Birmingham to understand, to feel that which is systematic racism. One can look just about anywhere, like, say, the Albina district of Portland, Oregon. Today, Portland is regarded as a liberal paradise where we all accept and love each other equally. A larger liberal populace has relocated to Portland in large numbers since the dawning of the new millennium, and strangely enough, many of these, quote, young liberals live in areas like Elliott, Humboldt, Alberta, and Irvington. Some 30 years ago, this was Portland's black neighborhood. Mired by poverty, depression, rampant drug problems, and prostitution at that time, today's Albina district is gentrified, rejuvenated, and white. As these neighborhoods improved, the population that had to endure its darkest decades has once again been forced to relocate to lower-income neighborhoods, replaced by young, opportunistic white liberals who expound about equal rights for all, without acknowledging the very places where they now live, representing a still existing racial undertone to Portland's liberal cloak. When Oregon was ratified as a state, they would be the only one in the Union to do so, with a clause that African Americans were prohibited from living within its borders. As Portland established itself as a city in the latter half of the 19th century, it was one of great racial hostility. It didn't even ratify the 15th Amendment, granting voting rights to all regardless of race, until 1959. People of Chinese, Japanese, and African descent all ultimately made it into the city, in many cases to work on the railroads. They would all be more or less segregated to small areas in town. A major fire that broke out in downtown Portland in 1873, destroying over 20 city blocks, was blamed on a Chinese laundry worker, and Portland's minority population suffered greatly for it. In later years, it is believed that this fire was arson, done by a white man looking to create trouble for the city's local Asian population. Such was Portland in its first century. The bulk of Portland's minute black population was in northern downtown, near Union Station, oddly the area that is now mostly considered to be Chinatown. This small population still managed to forge out a decent community for themselves. That was until 1919, when the city's realtors established new regulations that would prevent blacks from living in predominantly white neighborhoods. Being one of the whitest cities in America, as it still is, this left the options limited. Realtors openly believed a minority presence decreased the value of a property, and thus they wanted to have a stranglehold on where that minority property was. This, with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, drove practically all of Portland's black population from downtown to across the river, where they settled in what would become known as the Albina district. Once a bustling town, by the 1920s Albina was on the decline, and the white population was slowly moving out, leaving the door wide open to push the city's black population in. But still, by 1940, Portland's black population was incredibly small, numbering less than 5,000. But that was all about to change. By 1942, shipbuilding magnate Henry Kaiser was running one of the most prominent shipyards in America, and with the country at war, Kaiser reached out nationwide for all the workers he could bring in. People came from all over the country, including thousands of black people from the South. Of course, Albina was thought of as the first place to stick all of these short-term workers, but Albina was already becoming overcrowded. Instead, Kaiser purchased a large wetland near the Columbia River and constructed a temporary workers' village there, which came to be known as Vanport. At one time, some 40,000 workers lived in this village. What was so remarkable about this place was that despite clear elements of racism and segregation, Vanport, in its time, was likely the most legitimately integrated town in all of Oregon. The black workers were designated to certain parts of town, clear segregation. However, the schools were desegregated, and the education given there was spread equally unto all the children. Places like recreational facilities and churches were also desegregated. The workers all managed to perform their duties without any real strife or incident. This is not to say Vanport was the pinnacle of equality, but shockingly, it was better than most places out west. With World War II coming to an end in 1945, a large number of people left the town looking for new work, but many stayed. A higher number of black workers stayed because, with Portland's restrictive housing policy, there was hardly anywhere else to go. And while Vanport pressed on, the outsiders from Portland constantly criticized the town, calling it the, quote, Negro Project. It was essentially an extension of the Albina district, bordering it to the north. But in reality, environment-wise, they were two completely different places. There was also constant gossip about rampant crime in Vanport, even though crime there wasn't any worse than any other parts of Portland. This is where the real seeds of the black neighborhood as the criminal neighborhood were planted and would contaminate the Albina area for decades afterward. By May of 1948, major rainfall and flooding put Vanport in danger. Being a floodplain, with pretty much only a string of thin pieces of land holding back the rushing river, the townspeople worried, even when the authorities assured them they were in no danger. Then, on Memorial Day, May 31st, the land broke and water flooded into town. It was underwater in minutes. People struggled to save what they could and to pull their neighbors from the rushing waters. Everything was destroyed, leaving thousands of people, a quarter of which were black, completely homeless. While many were able to find replacement housing, much of Vanport's black population was stuck living amidst the remains of their fallen city. Moving them all into Albina would have doubled the area's population. Those who couldn't find anything solid left, while those who stayed ultimately found they had no choice. It was Albina or bust. Established in the 1870s, Albina boomed as its own city, a mostly white one, especially when Portland's streetcar system opened a line right through town. But by the 1920s, the shine of the streetcar system had gone. People were buying automobiles now, and Albina's star began to fade. With commerce decreasing, homes aging, the neighborhood was ripe for realtors to pick as the new, quote, black neighborhood. And as blacks moved in, whites moved out. With the new restrictive housing laws, Albina quickly became the only place a black person in Portland could live. Thus, by pushing minorities into the Albina area, not only could realtors presumably keep a boundary around where low property values would be, but it allowed the housing status in Albina to crumble over the next several decades. By the 1980s, over a third of all abandoned homes in Portland were in the Albina area. But still, in these early years, the citizens of this area managed to get by in most ways and thrive in a few others. Numerous restaurants and jazz clubs popped up, often bringing in major personalities like Sammy Davis Jr. The flame of black culture burned in this area. The civil rights movement had not yet hit full swing, and thus Albina existed with little incident throughout most of those early years. Then came Memorial Day 1948. A massive flood destroyed the town of Vanport in minutes. And with the restrictive housing measures kept by the city, practically all of Vanport's black population, numbering into the thousands, was forced to cram into Albina. This move had serious socioeconomic repercussions on the neighborhood in the forms of overcrowding and further economic hardship. The economy was already not so great in Albina, and now there were excessively more people living there in need of work. As the years passed on, the struggles only grew. Housing was substandard, schools were becoming overcrowded, and namely, being Portland's primarily black neighborhood, there was a constant police presence in the area. As the civil rights movement exploded going into the 1960s, it was exploding all over the country, and Portland was no exception. By the 60s, the citizens of Albina were tired of being broke, living in poor housing, and watching their children receive a meek education. Hostilities grew, only creating further animosity between the black citizens of Albina and the city's police and politicians, who for years had turned a blind eye to the plight that had been steadily growing there. This growing hostility was bolstered by the city's desire to use much of Lower Albina as their own personal grab bag for urban expansion efforts during the 1960s. In 1959, hundreds of homes were destroyed to make way for Portland's first major sports arena. And in the 60s, Portland's first freeway, Interstate 5, cut right through the west side of Albina. And finally, throughout the 1960s, the Emmanuel Hospital sought expansion, and behind the backs of the citizens there, commingled with the city of Portland to obtain a major piece of land in the heart of the town. Hundreds of families lost their homes for an expansion project that would just end up being abandoned in 1973. Today, a grassy field is all that remains there, as a reminder of what greed can get you. These expansions only furthered the overcrowding and diverted people away from neighborhood businesses. One's best shot was to own a business on Union Avenue, today Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. The endless neglect and disconnect from those in power in the city of Portland only bred anger and hostility as the years passed, with organizations like the Black Panthers coming into being, preaching a more aggressive approach as far as obtaining civil rights. Harsher activism caught on with Albina's younger population. They watched and identified as hostilities grew in the early 60s, and by 1967 they exploded with riots happening all over America, be it Tampa, Newark, or Detroit. Fear spread throughout Portland overnight. Everyone wondered, was this also going to happen here? This led to a more aggressive approach by police to, quote, keep order. They patrolled Albina constantly, which only stoked the flames of contention. Amidst this conflict, plans for a rally at Portland's Irving Park at the end of July were being prepared. With recent events, there was an immediate fear of violence. The rally was poorly organized, and at one point, a handful of agitators began chanting that they should, quote, kill the honkies. While most had come to rally and not to incite anything, the few who did seek trouble brought the police to the scene. Several nearby businesses had their windows broken, and a few fires broke out. While the event surely didn't qualify quite as a riot, it was a sign of things to come.
Earlier today, all factions of our community and our different agencies got together and made a decision that we simply will not allow the mayor, the city hall, or anybody else to continue to intimidate, to browbeat, and to threaten the security of Albina. Albina is independent in that it is not linked with any other community, and Albina is going to protect itself. One of the first moves to be rational about it is that we're going to ask the governor to intercede immediately and to take local law enforcement over from the city and put it into the hands of the state, because this is an emergency situation. And in such an emergency situation, there should be a state of emergency declared on this city. We are consistently begging and pleading and negotiating for means and ways to solve these problems. We have called Chief Jones time after time. We have caucused with him, and we have made it clear that the community does not wish to abuse the city, and the community will not be abused by the city. These words have went unheeded, and today we call for Chief Jones and Mayor Schrunk's resignation on the grounds that they are mentally incompetent and incapable of running our city, and that they have caused the pain and the inflictions upon the poor and the hardened and the citizens of our community.
So I'm walking through Irving Park today. We're in the Irvington district, and this is the place. This is where, there was rioting happening all over America in 1967. And Portland had, somewhat kept its cool to a degree. But the black population in this city was suffering in the same ways that they were all over the country. So it was only a matter of time before, the lid blew. And there was a rally being held here shortly after a lot of the rioting was happening in other places. So people in the city were real nervous. And as with most rallies, there's always 20, 30 people that want to, make a fight, want to make a riot out of it. And that group showed up, started hooting and hollering. The rally was very poorly organized. They hadn't really had a whole lot in this area yet. And the small hooligan faction, essentially, it started here, the anger, and then it expanded onto the streets. And businesses had their windows broken, a few small fires were set, and it wasn't really a riot, but it was a sign that what was happening all across the country could happen here. And when this event happened here in Irving Park in 1967, it should have been taken seriously, but it was more or less swept under the rug. And because of that, the problems persisted, and the hostilities that were forming grew. So things like what happened here in Irving Park were destined to happen again, only they were destined to be much worse. For the sake of avoiding embarrassment, the whole event was downplayed in the press, but Albina was changed. Businesses along Union Avenue began boarding up portions of their buildings to protect them, giving the one successful business stretch in Albina a depressed and slummy look that deterred customers. Businesses that could began moving out of the area, leaving many buildings boarded up and empty. the police attitude towards blacks, especially young people, grew harsher. With this event in Irving Park swept simply under the rug, the aggression in the neighborhood remained. But with conditions worsening, the agitation could only grow with it. And to counter that aggression, police were even more of a constant staple in Albina, likened by some who lived there to be like plantation owners watching over their slaves. These hostilities with law enforcement, coupled with the more militant attitude that was growing in the Albina district, it was only a matter of time before the next bomb dropped. On the evening of June 13th, 1969, police were called to Union Avenue and Schaefer to address some teens who were breaking bottles and throwing rocks. The police arrived outside of Lidio's Drive-In to see a plethora of black youths gathered there. Man, it feels so weird knowing what I know now to be walking right to the intersection of MLK Junior Boulevard, which used to be Union Avenue, and Schaefer. This was the epicenter of the riots that happened in Portland in 1969, June 1969. Now, in terms of Lidio's Drive-In, I'm not 100% sure where that was located. You've got the infamous gray building right over here. I don't think Lidio's was located in there. I haven't been able to find that in any of the research I've done. The lot over here, this is all open. That could have been where it was. It may have been in this building. This looks more like a retail type store. It could have been that building there, that bluish one. I'm really not sure. I'm on the other side of MLK, and I'm noticing this building's very new, so it's possible that obviously another building was there at one time. Maybe that's what Lidio's was. I also haven't been able to ascertain if it was exactly on specifically this corner, but it was in this region. If I find out exactly where it was, I'll be sure to do a follow-up video. But you know what? Because I love the gray building so much, we're just going to assume that Lidio's is right here next to it. The police claim they tried arresting a 15-year-old for breaking curfew when a fracas started. But the manager of Lidio's said that it was when the police began using clubs on two girls they were attempting to arrest when a scuffle broke out. Either way, the teens in front of Lidio's fought with the police. They broke windows, and generally an all-out fight between police and black teens broke out on that block. By morning, the bomb was presumably defused. Police managed to clear Union Avenue, but excessive damage had been done. The police held the youths entirely responsible, while the youths claimed the police instigated things. In the following days, it would be claimed that this incident was instigated by the police in particular to arrest as many black militants as they could with the city's Rose Festival about to be underway. They may have feared an incident happening there. As things calmed on Saturday the 14th, Sunday the 15th, things erupted again when several black teens were removed from Holiday Park, where a major Rose Festival event was planned to take place. They relocated north, back towards Lidio's, where another riot broke out. This time, firebombs were used, damaging several businesses and starting several fires. Surprisingly, when police arrived on the scene, everyone dispersed rather quickly. What also wasn't mentioned in the local press was the fact that in these prevailing days, several officers, incognito, were driving through Albina looking for teens to rough up. This likely further sparked this second day of serious rioting that occurred on the 15th. More firebombing erupted on Tuesday the 17th, destroying several more businesses. Over 20 black youths were rounded up for arson charges, and after a threat by Portland's police chief to bring in the National Guard to handle things, the situation finally cooled there on Union Avenue. It was as close to an all-out riot as I think there's ever been in the history of Portland. And something else I'm noticing about this area, because it's known that multiple buildings were destroyed beyond repair in those fire bombings that happened primarily on June 15th, 1969. And something I'm noticing is there's a lot of spots near this intersection of what was Union Avenue and Schaefer. There's lots of open lots now where you can tell there used to be buildings. And I'm wondering if those places are specifically empty because of those fire bombings and those buildings being destroyed beyond repair. Maybe those buildings were torn down in the aftermath and the spaces have sat either empty or transformed into parking lots. When rioting happens, it's mostly all that anyone sees. They don't see the years of neglect, disrespect, inhumanity, ignorance, depression, and restriction, existing for years, decades, the pain that pushes humans to such an extent that they explode. What occurred here in Albina in 1969 was just that, a result of unceasing racism and disrespect, the likes that no person, regardless of any color they may be, should have to endure. It should be of no surprise then that this wasn't just Portland, but this was America in the late 1960s. While the issue of rioting in Albina would gradually fade away, and some improvements would come, primarily in the form of major educational reform in Portland heading into the 1980s, life in Albina was anything but getting better. As the late 60s drive of the civil rights movement calmed into the 70s, it seemed the city of Portland felt they could resume their stance of leaving the Albina area to its own devices. Homes continued to crumble, violence grew, businesses continued to close, and as buildings in Albina stood vacant, banks refused to make loans to black business owners and entrepreneurs who wanted to fill these buildings, and thus they continued to empty out. While the Black Panthers sought a more charitable existence in Portland, the city was always weary of their motives. A bombing of a McDonald's in the early 1970s on Union Avenue was unjustly blamed on them, and their reputation was permanently tarnished in the city. With poverty so prevalent, many of those in Albina took to dealing crack cocaine, which became America's hard drug of choice in the 1980s. The drug trade brought even more violence to the area. Many women in the area turned to prostitution to make money. By the 1980s, the Albina area had finally become an all-out ghetto, brought on by the city as a whole's unwillingness to care for the welfare of its citizens there. The rest of the city grew used to hearing about gun deaths, drug busts, thefts, arson, and so on in this part of town. And then came the economic boom of the 1990s. After several years in limbo, the city of Portland suddenly found itself in an economic climb, which led the city to begin reviving many of its struggling communities, which mostly existed in the Albina area. Millions were put into these neighborhoods, fixing up houses and buildings, bringing businesses back to the area. Crime was diminishing in all areas. The drug trade dulled to a low roar. It was what the people of Albina had been clamoring for decades. However, with improvements came increases in property value. Through the end of the 90s into the 21st century, much of Albina's black population was weeded out because they simply couldn't afford to live there anymore. The quality of life grew, and then white people returned to the Albina area for the first time in over 50 years. When one looks at this area today, you'd hardly believe what it had been forcibly reduced to only decades before. But in that same vein, little has changed. Buildings have changed, places have changed, but quality of life? Those who have it good and those who don't, it hasn't really changed that much. Many of the black families that lived in squalor in Albina now live in similar trying circumstances elsewhere, on the Far East Side. Gentrification may solve problems of physical beauty, but it's done little to address the issue of underlying racism that still exists here in Portland and has existed ever since it became a city all those many years ago.